Hey guys, Erman here from Systematic Productions. Today we'll be taking your cymbal tracks from sounding like this to sounding like this. Now, the very first thing we need to do is define how we're going to route our tracks. So as you can see, we have a hi-hat track, an overhead track, and a ride cymbal track. For most intents and purposes, you can route all three of these into a singular bus and process them together. For the sake of this particular comparison, what we're going to do is route the overheads and the ride into one bus, but keep the hi-hats separate so they can cut through. We'll begin by going to our overhead bus track and taking a listen. As you can tell, the overheads sound fairly flat, unexciting, a little bit woody. Let's try and correct that with a bit of EQ. One of the very first things you'll be looking to initiate with overheads is a high-pass filter. Now, the amount that you high-pass will depend on the kind of drum aesthetic you're chasing, combined with the sort of music that you're working on. So let's take a listen and see what we can get. It might sound excessively thin, but in this particular case, we're going for about 300 Hz. This will make a lot more sense in context with the full mix later on. So our next step is the flat mid-range that we get at around 600 to 800 Hz. Now we have to use some imagination when we deal with overheads. When we get rid of the lower and the mid frequencies, things start to sound excessively thin, but it will all make a lot more sense once we get the whole mix in check. Now that this has been subdued, the next point that we want to look at is a very key frequency range for overheads, which is around 4K. Most cymbals have an overabundance of upper mid-range between 3 to 5 kHz. Usually 4K is a good center point to attenuate that. Alright, now we're getting somewhere. So the next thing that we can hear on these particular overheads is that there's a little bit of zingy stuff happening a little bit higher than 4K. In this particular case, it's around about 6. So let's take a listen and see if we can attenuate some of that. Alright, so we're starting to shape up. Now, the very last thing we'll do for these particular overheads is initiate a low-pass filter. Now, this is to taste. You don't have to do this. You can do this your own way. However, I've generally found that attenuating the super high frequencies after going through a drastic EQ process like this can help get everything in check and sound good with the whole mix. Around about 16K sounds good. Now let's listen to the drum bus. Alright, not too bad, we're getting somewhere. Our second stage of processing involves a fairly new plugin. Now, if you don't have a copy of Soothe, don't stress, this isn't strictly necessary, however it can really help. One thing that we're using Soothe for is chasing down resonances in the upper mid-range around about 4K. The way that Soothe helps us in a way that a traditional EQ doesn't is that it chases those resonances in real time. This is obviously really helpful for overhead tracks because the various cymbals being hit all have different resonant frequencies. So if we take a listen to how it works. So as you can hear, the higher up I jog the depth, the more it cuts back the upper mid-range. It's very easy to overdo tools like this, so it's important to take it easy. Set a fairly narrow bandwidth to start with, and make sure you're just targeting the frequencies that are getting unruly and out of control. Generally, you want the stereo link at about 0% to correlate with stereo material, and be extremely careful with the depth. Our next stage of processing involves a very tried and true plugin on overheads, the trusty Waves L1. Now, the reason that we kick this in is essentially just to control the amount of snare that we get through our overheads. So let's listen to how it works. Can you hear the amount of snare changing as I jog it up and down? The key is to set this so it just grabs the snare without affecting the rest of the cymbal balance. It takes a bit of practice to get this right, but with work you'll get there. Generally, less is better than more. Our final stage of processing for our overhead bus is a stage of console saturation along with a little bit of compression. In my case, I'll be using Slate VMR for this. So as you can see, I've got an instance of the red compressor here and an instance of SSL saturation just to kind of fatten things out and bring them together a little bit. A very important thing to keep in mind with compression on overheads is that cymbals traditionally don't like compression very much, so you have to keep the ratio relatively low. In my case, it generally goes from 2 to 3 depending on what you're after. Attack is generally around about medium to slow, and a fast release. Even so, you can hear that it's mostly responding to snare hits, if anything. With the console saturation, we just jog up the drive until things sound nice and rounded out. This particular model has a very good lower mid-range focus, which helps on cymbals and attenuating their inherent harshness. And now that we've finished processing our overhead bus, let's move to our hi-hat track. Now, as mentioned before, the hi-hats are going into their own bus and aren't being affected by any of the processing we've done thus far. So the key thing to understand with what we've done to our hi-hats is that it's very similar to the overheads themselves with a few key differences. So we've got a high-pass filter set to a similar range. We've got a mid-range cut at about 700 Hz. We have the quintessential upper mid-range cut at 4K. We have a tiny bit of brightening at about 8.5K. This is to help the sizzle of the hi-hats cut through the bed of the overheads. And we have our low-pass filter to keep the super highs in check. So if we listen to the differences, as you can hear, it sounds a little bit more zingy, a little bit more harsh, but in context with the mix, it'll work. From here on out, we've got our standard stage of console saturation to fatten things out and bring the high mids in check. And of course, we've got its own compressor. Now, the compressor running on the hi-hat track is set differently to the one running on the overhead track. And this is very important because it allows the hi-hats to cut through the bed of the overheads. And on some arrangements like this one, where the hats are quite zingy and they move the chorus, this is quite important. So let's take a listen to the drum mix with and without the hi-hat track. As you can hear, it makes a hell of a difference. One of the key ways to bind the top-end frequencies of the mix together is to listen to the overheads up alongside the vocals and the synth tracks. In this case, we've got some synths to listen to, so let's balance out against those. As we can hear, we're already pretty damn close. The only other thing to note at this point is that we've been mixing all of this into a reverb. Now, the reverb settings aren't essential. Dial one up to taste and just blend it in until things sound right. You You can hear that the snare and the cymbals gain a really nice tail and air once you get it right. So with that all in place, let's listen to our full mix. Not too bad. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to comment, share and subscribe. There are more videos on the way. Make sure to check out a copy of my book, The Systematic Mixing Guide, and until next time, see you then.